June 4, 1942, dawn breaks slowly over the Pacific Ocean. The sea is calm, almost deceptively so. A pale light spreads across the flight decks of American aircraft carriers drifting northeast of Midway Atoll. Engines cough awake. Deck crews move with quiet urgency, their silhouettes cutting through the mist. The smell of fuel hangs heavy in the air. Somewhere beyond the horizon, an enemy fleet far larger, far more experienced, prepares for its own strike. Pilots climb into cramped cockpits knowing the odds are against them. Many have never seen combat. Some will not return. They do not know that enemy carriers are already arming their planes. They do not know that mere minutes will decide the balance of an entire ocean. Far to the west, aboard Japanese carriers, officers check watches and flight schedules with confidence earned from months of uninterrupted victory. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, everywhere numbers have brought success. But beneath the surface of this morning, beneath steel decks and flight plans, something invisible is already moving. Something that does not rely on numbers at all. And to understand how this moment came to exist, the world must rewind to the months before Midway, when the war in the Pacific still seemed decided. By the spring of 1942, the balance of power in the Pacific appeared brutally clear, imperial. Japan had not merely entered the war, it had reshaped it. In less than 6 months, Japanese forces had carved a vast empire across the western Pacific and Southeast Asia. Hong Kong fell in December 1941. Manila followed soon after. Singapore, once considered impregnable, surrendered in February 1942. The Dutch East Indies collapsed under coordinated naval and air assaults. Each victory reinforced the same conclusion inside Japanese naval circles. Speed, surprise, and superior numbers had broken every opponent placed in their path. At the center of this success stood the Imperial Japanese Navy, its carrier force the Kido. Butai was the most powerful naval striking arm ever assembled. 6 fleet carriers had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision. Their pilots were veterans, trained under an unforgiving system that produced elite aviators at the cost of time and manpower. Every carrier battle group moved as a unified weapon, rehearsed to near perfection. Japan did not merely possess numbers. It possessed experience, cohesion, and confidence. The United States Navy, by contrast, was wounded and uncertain. Pearl Harbor had destroyed or damaged 8 battleships and killed over 2,400 Americans in a single morning. Although the aircraft carriers had survived by chance, the psychological impact was immense. The Pacific Fleet had been caught unprepared, its doctrines outdated, its leadership suddenly forced to rethink centuries of naval warfare. In Washington, the reality was grim. The United States was now fighting a global war on 2 fronts, with Germany considered the primary threat. Resources flowed toward Europe first, leaving the Pacific stretched thin. American shipyards worked around the clock, but new carriers and aircraft would take time. Japan was determined not to allow yet, even as Japanese forces advanced, cracks were forming beneath the surface of their success. Japan's strategy rested on a dangerous assumption that a single, decisive blow could break American will. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been intended to cripple the U.S. Navy long enough for Japan to secure a defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands. Once established, Japanese planners believed the United States, facing enormous distances, high casualties, and domestic fatigue, would negotiate rather than fight a prolonged war. This belief shaped every decision that followed, but the American response defied expectations. Rather than retreat, the United States adapted. Carrier warfare, once secondary to battleship doctrine, was thrust to the forefront. Men like Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, recognized that the war would be decided not by armor and big guns, but by flight decks and range. Early 1942 brought hard lessons. The American raids against the Marshall Islands achieved little materially but proved something vital. U.S. carriers could strike and withdraw. The Doolittle raid in April 1942, though militarily insignificant, shook Japanese confidence by demonstrating that the homeland was not untouchable. For the first time, Japanese leaders were forced to confront the possibility that their perimeter was already under threat. Still, On paper, the imbalance remained overwhelming. By mid-1942, Japan possessed more operational fleet carriers than the United States. Its pilots logged hundreds of combat hours, while American aviators trained under accelerated programs, often with minimal sea experience. Japanese naval aircraft, the Zero fighter, the Val dive bomber, the Kate torpedo bomber had proven lethal across the Pacific. Numbers, quality, and momentum all favored Japan. Yet war is never decided by numbers alone, hidden from view. Inside low-ceilinged rooms in Hawaii, a small group of American cryptanalysts worked in near isolation. Their efforts did not produce immediate victories. There were no parades, no headlines, but slowly, fragments of Japanese naval communications began to align. Patterns emerged. Codenames repeated. A future operation, still undefined, began to take shape. At the same time, Japanese leadership grew restless. Despite their victories, the American carrier force remained unbroken. Each surviving carrier represented a threat, a mobile, unpredictable weapon that could not be ignored. To secure their empire, Japan would need to draw these carriers out and destroy them in a single, annihilating battle. That belief would set the course toward Midway. And as Japanese planners refined their next move, the Pacific edged closer to a confrontation that neither side yet fully understood. The idea began as a solution to uncertainty. By early 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, faced a problem his victories had not solved. The American aircraft carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown remained operational. They had avoided destruction at Pearl Harbor. They had slipped through Japanese patrol lines again and again. And as long as they existed, Japan's defensive perimeter was an illusion. Yamamoto understood the mathematics of war better than most. Japan could not win a prolonged conflict against American industrial capacity. Ship for ship, pilot for pilot, time favored the United States. Japan needed a decisive battle, one that would shatter American carrier strength before replacement forces could arrive. Midway Atoll offered that opportunity. Midway was small, isolated, and strategically positioned. Lying roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, it guarded the approaches to Pearl Harbor itself. If Midway fell, Japan could extend its defensive ring eastward and threaten Hawaii directly. More importantly, Yamamoto believed an attack on Midway would force the U.S. Navy to respond. American carriers, he reasoned, would rush to defend the atoll, and there, waiting in ambush, Japan's superior forces would destroy them. The plan that emerged was ambitious to the point of fragility. Japanese forces would strike Midway with carrier aircraft, neutralizing its defenses. An invasion force would follow, securing the atoll. Meanwhile, Yamamoto would hold the main body of the combined fleet, including battleships, far to the west, ready to deliver the final blow once the American carriers revealed themselves. To further complicate American decision-making, a secondary operation would target the Aleutian Islands, drawing attention northward. On paper, the numbers were decisive. Japan committed 4 fleet carriers to the Midway operation: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the core of the same force that had attacked Pearl Harbor. These carriers embarked over 240 aircraft, flown by the most experienced naval aviators in the world. Supporting them were battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and invasion transports spread across multiple task forces. In total, the operation involved more than 200 ships. Opposing them, the United States could muster just 3 carriers. Enterprise and Hornet formed Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Yorktown, damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea only weeks earlier, was rushed back into service under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. American carrier aircraft were fewer in number, often inferior in performance, and flown by crews with limited combat experience. From a purely numerical and qualitative standpoint, the outcome appeared inevitable, but Yamamoto's plan relied on secrecy, and that secrecy had already been compromised. Unbeknownst to Japanese commanders, American codebreakers at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor had been reading portions of Japan's naval code, JN-25, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort. The team had identified a target referred to as AF. Intelligence analysis suggested AF was Midway, but confirmation was needed. A simple ruse was devised. Midway transmitted an unencrypted message reporting a water shortage. Soon after, Japanese intercepts mentioned AF suffering from water problems. The conclusion was undeniable. The United States now knew where Japan intended to strike and roughly when. Admiral Nimitz made a decision that would define the war. Rather than defend Midway passively, he would commit his carriers in advance, positioning them northeast of the atoll. The goal was not to meet Japan ship for ship, but to strike first before Japanese numbers could be brought fully to bear. Speed replaced caution. Repair crews worked around the clock to make Yorktown seaworthy. Aircraft squadrons were reorganized, reinforced, and rushed aboard. There would be no reinforcements. No second chance. Meanwhile, Japanese planners moved forward, unaware that their enemy was waiting. The combined fleet sailed with confidence. Orders were clear. Timetables were precise. The assumption remained unchallenged. American forces would react, not anticipate. As May turned into June, 2 fleets closed the distance across thousands of miles of open ocean. One carried numerical superiority and absolute faith in its doctrine. The other carried knowledge, urgency, and the understanding that failure meant the loss of the Pacific. Everything now depended on timing. And when dawn arrived on June 4, 1942, the battle would be decided not by how many ships sailed, but by what each side truly understood. For the men who would fight at Midway, numbers meant little once the aircraft left the deck. American pilots rose before dawn in cramped carrier berths, aware only that this mission would be different. Intelligence briefings were sparse. The enemy was out there, but unseen. Many aviators were reservists, former civilians trained at accelerated speeds. They carried the weight of Pearl Harbor, of friends lost, of a Navy still searching for confidence. Fear was present, but so was resolve. The Pacific offered no trenches, no cover. A pilot's world narrowed to an engine, an altimeter, and the ocean stretching endlessly below. There would be no retreat once fuel ran low. Survival depended on discipline, luck, and formation integrity. Across the water, Japanese pilots prepared with calm precision. They were veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids. Their training had been exhaustive and unforgiving. To them, carrier warfare was an art perfected through repetition. Many believed American aviators lacked the skill and courage to meet them in open battle. Yet experience carried its own burden. Japanese pilots knew what combat demanded. They had seen friends die. And unlike the Americans, they understood something unspoken. Replacements were few. Losses could not be easily replaced. Each sortie carried more than risk. It carried the slow erosion of Japan's future strength. Both sides climbed into their aircraft that morning as individuals. Numbers existed only on charts. In the air, war would be decided by moments, not statistics. The two navies approached carrier warfare with fundamentally different assumptions. Japanese doctrine emphasized the massed, coordinated strike. Multiple carriers would launch large waves, overwhelming enemy defenses through sheer concentration. Precision timing was essential. Aircraft were armed, fueled, and launched according to strict schedules. When executed correctly, the system was devastating, as Pearl Harbor had proven, but this precision demanded rigidity. Aircraft on Japanese carriers were rearmed below decks, a time-consuming and dangerous process. Hangar decks were crowded with fueled planes, bombs, and torpedoes. The first American reconnaissance aircraft spotted the Japanese fleet. 4 carriers, massive battleships, cruisers, and supporting destroyers stretched across the horizon. From high altitude, the Japanese fleet appeared untouchable, a floating fortress of steel and precision. To the men in the planes, the distance seemed impossible. To the men on the decks, the moment of reckoning had arrived. Vice Admiral Nagamo, aboard the Akagi, faced a dilemma. His carriers were fully loaded with planes armed for a strike against Midway, not American carriers. Rearming them for anti-ship attacks would take precious minutes he did not have. Pilots shuffled nervously. Mechanics adjusted ordnance, and the hum of engines mixed with the metallic scent of aviation fuel. Every choice was irreversible. The first wave of American torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Hornet dove toward the Japanese fleet. They were slow, lightly armed, and immediately met with a storm of Japanese Zero fighters. The Val dive bombers and Kates took off to meet them, and within minutes, hundreds of rounds of machine gun fire tore through the sky. Torpedo squadrons were decimated. Of 41 American planes in the initial attack, only 6 returned. Losses were catastrophic, yet the attack had done something no one expected. It forced Japanese fighters down to low altitude and disrupted carrier deck operations. At Soryu, decks were crowded with planes being refueled and rearmed. Bombs for Midway attacks lay alongside torpedoes hastily transferred from hangars. Every second of delay multiplied risk. With fighters away, decks were exposed. Anti-aircraft gunners rotated, loading shells into magazines that still lacked full-range calibration. Chaos, invisible from command charts, was taking root. Meanwhile, high above the fleet, scout planes struggled to locate American carriers. Sunlight reflected off waves, hiding silhouettes and confusing range estimates. Each report took precious minutes to reach Nagamo. His decision-making became a dangerous loop of hesitation. Strike now with partially armed planes, or wait for confirmation while vulnerability increased below decks. Below, American pilots, though beaten and outnumbered, were accomplishing the impossible. Torpedo attacks drew Japanese fighters down, creating gaps in the defensive umbrella. Dive bomber squadrons from Enterprise, arriving later, climbed higher unnoticed. The Japanese fleet remained unaware that their largest vulnerability was not firepower, but timing. Every minute they delayed shifted the advantage. By 7 o'clock, the first bombs began to fall on the carriers themselves, not the planes in the air, but the ships bristling with ordnance. Fires erupted, spreading across fuel-soaked decks. Explosions tore through hangars where planes had been stacked in preparation for strikes. Panic ensued. Crewmen fought blazes as the horizon shimmered with smoke and heat. Superior numbers meant nothing against the convergence of human error, timing, and a perfectly executed high-altitude dive. Amid the smoke and chaos, the battle began to pivot. The Japanese assumed their dominance remained. Their carriers were larger, their pilots more experienced, their numbers overwhelming. Yet the moment of true advantage had already passed to the Americans. Hidden in the sky, in timing, in intelligence that Nagamo could not see, the stage was set for a single, decisive strike, the one that would shatter the illusion of Japanese invincibility. By 10:20, the American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet, from 15,000 feet. The SBD Dauntlesses of Enterprise and Yorktown descended in tight formations. The sun glinted off wings and fuselages, momentarily blinding both attackers and defenders. Nagamo's carriers were still crowded with armed planes, fueled and stacked on decks. Anti-aircraft fire lit the sky, but the bombs fell with near-perfect timing. Kaga erupted first. A 1,000-pound bomb pierced the flight deck, detonating amid fuel tanks. Flames raced along hangars, engulfing armed aircraft in a roaring inferno. Explosions tore through the upper decks, hurling debris and men into the sea. Within minutes, the carrier was a blackened silhouette against a smoke-filled horizon. Seconds later, Akagi suffered the same fate. Fire and explosions ripped through the hangars. Crewmen scrambled, but the conflagration moved faster than any human could control. Soryu followed, struck by bombs that penetrated decks and detonated munitions. Nagamo watched from the bridge, powerless as his most valuable assets burned. The final carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack. Torpedo bombers and dive planes took off in waves, but chaos had spread. American fighters, now alerted, intercepted with deadly accuracy. Fuel shortages, disrupted formations, and exhausted pilots compounded losses. By the afternoon, Hiryu itself was set ablaze after successive dive bomber strikes. The Japanese carrier force, once invincible on paper, had been effectively annihilated in a matter of hours. Timing, intelligence, and sheer persistence had leveled the numerical imbalance. The human cost was staggering. Japanese carrier crews suffered thousands of casualties. Experienced pilots months or years in the making were gone, irreplaceable. Fires consumed ships that had dominated the Pacific only days before. Meanwhile, the Americans, though heavily taxed, retained their carriers and their ability to fight another day. The momentum had shifted irreversibly. The battle that began with numerical superiority, with confidence in numbers and experience, ended with a single factor overriding it: precision, timing, and foresight. The United States Navy had done more than survive. They had rewritten the strategic landscape of the Pacific. As smoke drifted across the sea and the morning gave way to afternoon, the war in the Pacific was no longer a foregone conclusion. Japanese dominance, once assumed, had been broken. The stage was set for a protracted struggle, but now, with Americans holding the initiative, and with Midway decided, the consequences would ripple far beyond this single day, reshaping strategies, morale, and the course of the entire Pacific War. By nightfall on June 4, 1942, the Pacific Ocean carried the scars of one of history's most decisive naval battles. Fire still smoldered on the remnants of Japanese carriers. Smoke columns rose from the water where torpedoes and bombs had claimed vessels. The sea itself was dotted with wreckage-burned aircraft, floating ordnance, and the bodies of sailors. The losses were staggering. Japan had lost 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These ships had represented the core of the Kido Butai, the most formidable carrier strike force in existence. Thousands of sailors and pilots, many of them veterans who had survived Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids, were killed. The death of these experienced aviators could not be replaced quickly. Japan's naval air power had been irreversibly weakened. The material loss alone, over 200 aircraft destroyed, hundreds of tons of aviation fuel and munitions consumed, crippled the fleet's operational capacity. For the United States, the victory came at a high cost but with a strategic dividend. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, survived, though Yorktown had sustained damage during the battle. Torpedo squadrons had been nearly annihilated. Planes and pilots were lost in almost equal measure. Yet the carriers remained operational, a testament to the resilience of American logistics, repair crews, and leadership. Within days, Yorktown would be patched sufficiently to continue operations, a remarkable feat that amplified the symbolic impact of Midway. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate. Japanese confidence, once unshakable, was shaken. Imperial officers had long assumed that the United States would fold under attrition, that Japan's numerical superiority would eventually overwhelm the enemy. Midway proved that assumption wrong. The loss of 4 carriers and elite pilots shattered the aura of invincibility that had accompanied Japanese forces since December 1941. American morale, conversely, soared. Pearl Harbor had been a humiliation, Coral Sea a defensive stalemate. Now, for the first time, the United States had decisively struck back. Naval command gained confidence not just in surviving the Pacific, but in shaping the war through strategy and intelligence. For ordinary sailors and aviators, the victory offered proof that courage, preparation, and foresight could overcome raw numbers and experience. Even more crucially, Midway reshaped the operational calculus. Japan could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. The initiative shifted. The Imperial Navy's future offensive operations were constrained. Every subsequent mission would now carry the shadow of potential American foreknowledge. The era of unchecked Japanese expansion was over, replaced by a tense, attritional struggle for control of the Pacific. And yet, the aftermath was more than numbers and losses. Fires extinguished, wrecks counted, bodies recovered. The human dimension, grief, shock, and the dawning awareness of vulnerability extended far beyond the decks of sinking ships. Both sides faced the sobering truth. In war, superiority on paper cannot account for ingenuity, timing, or intelligence. The immediate victory at Midway set the stage for strategic choices that would reverberate across months and oceans. The battle had ended, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. In the days following Midway, the strategic landscape of the Pacific shifted dramatically. Japan, once unchallenged, now faced the reality that the United States could predict and counter its moves. Admiral Yamamoto, who had meticulously planned the Midway operation, saw his strategy unravel in hours. The destruction of 4 carriers stripped the Imperial Navy of its striking core. Battleships alone could no longer dominate the vast Pacific. Without carrier air power, Japan's ability to project force was severely curtailed. The Americans seized the initiative. With 3 carriers still intact, Nimitz could plan offensive operations rather than merely react. Intelligence, previously a supporting tool, had proven decisive. The success of code-breaking at Station HYPO validated years of painstaking cryptanalysis and demonstrated that understanding the enemy could outweigh raw numbers. Operations were no longer purely a contest of firepower. They became a game of anticipation, timing, and decision-making under uncertainty. The psychological shock for Japan was profound. Officers and pilots who had survived the early months of the war, the victories that had seemed inexorable, now faced the sobering truth that their skill and experience could not guarantee success. Midway shattered morale and introduced caution into planning that had previously been aggressive, almost audacious. Japanese naval expansion, previously considered unstoppable, slowed. Japan was forced onto the defensive in the Pacific, retreating from previously held positions and reconsidering plans for further conquest. For the United States, Midway was more than a tactical victory. It was a validation of leadership under pressure. Rear Admiral Spruance, often criticized for being cautious, was praised for measured decisiveness. Fletcher's judgment in coordinating carriers and launches, coupled with the courage of pilots who attacked, despite overwhelming odds, became a model of command under uncertainty. The Navy gained confidence in its ability to not only survive but dictate the pace of war. Midway also influenced the global perception of the Pacific conflict. Allies and enemies alike recognized that Japanese dominance could be challenged. The notion that numerical superiority alone determined outcomes was dismantled. Across the Pacific, both sides adjusted strategies. The Japanese increased caution, dispersed forces, and delayed ambitious offensives, while the Americans invested heavily in training, aircraft production, and intelligence infrastructure to maintain the edge revealed at Midway. Numbers had once seemed decisive. But Midway proved that timing, intelligence, and the interplay of human decisions could append even overwhelming superiority. The battle shifted the psychological momentum of the Pacific War. Japan's aura of invincibility was broken. The United States, battered but resolute, now held the initiative. The stage was set for a long, grueling conflict across thousands of miles of ocean, but one that would no longer be dictated solely by Japanese numerical strength. Midway had changed everything. Midway remains a lesson in the limits of numbers. The Japanese fleet, confident and vast, believed that experience and quantity could dictate the course of the war. Yet it was neither quantity nor raw skill that determined the outcome. It was insight, timing, and the courage to act on imperfect information. The victory reshaped the Pacific War, not merely through ships lost or pilots killed, but through the invisible forces of intelligence, decision-making, and human resilience. American cryptanalysts, working far from the ocean's horizon, had altered history before a single bomb fell. Commanders who embraced uncertainty rather than fear it achieved what sheer power alone could not. And for the men in the air and on the decks, bravery, sometimes desperate, sometimes methodical, proved decisive. Midway teaches that warfare is not a ledger of forces, but a choreography of choices. Numbers can intimidate, dominate, or even destroy, but they cannot foresee, cannot adapt, cannot anticipate. A smaller, informed, and determined force can append even overwhelming superiority, leaving the world to reconsider assumptions about strength, strategy, and fate. As the smoke of burning carriers drifted across the Pacific, the war itself shifted in character. Japan would never again hold uncontested command of the seas. The United States gained not only material advantage but a psychological edge, a proof that preparation, foresight, and courage could rewrite what seemed inevitable. Midway became more than a battle. It became a symbol of how knowledge, timing, and human will can change the course of history. Even decades later, the story resonates. They had numbers, but in the end, understanding changed everything.